This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, hold on 1 second.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll give you introduction first, and after that, give you things.
Okay.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Our today meeting is gonna be with Mr. JC. He's based in New York in the United States, and he's certified SOLIDWORKS expert and industrial process consultant at Dassault System. Our meeting together is to get more information about animating in SOLIDWORKS Visualize, and it's gonna be cool. I'm really excited to get more information about that. Hi Jesse, welcome.
Good morning. Good afternoon, wherever you're coming from.
Yeah. Okay, let me stop my screen share and give it to you. Feel free to share your slide.
Sounds good. Okay, you guys have my screen?
Yeah, I see it's obvious.
Excellent. All right, well, thanks for the introduction. Again, my name is Jesse. I am an industry process consultant at Dassault Systèmes. This is going to be a fun presentation. If you've caught a presentation of mine, it was probably on Visualize somewhere along the way. But I don't often talk about animation, and we were just kind of talking at the beginning of this call that animation is a cool way to morph what you may already know about setting up things in Visualize and kind of take that to the next level of having things actually move around and interact the way that they, that they actually would in real life. The downside is that animations can get a little bit confusing, so you need to know a little bit of background information about how that works. So hopefully I can fill in some gaps maybe for you in that process of what animation even looks like and then how that applies to SOLIDWORKS Visualize. So hopefully this will be a fun one. This is what I look like in black and white if you're curious. I'm in color hopefully for you today.
Yeah.
So really what I wanted to do here is answer a few questions, and hopefully I have a tendency when I get talking about Visualize to just kind of ramble on for a while. So hopefully I won't do that today, and I can leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end if you have any questions. We'll hopefully save some time for that. But the three questions that I kind of wanted to address as I was thinking about setting this up for you guys is what do you need to know before you get into it? Because as I mentioned, with animation, there is a tendency to jump in and then say, okay, well, how do I even start? Like, where do I even go to make something move or something happen? So we'll take a look at some of the brief background information of things you might need to know. Obviously, the key thing is, okay, once you know the background information, then how do we actually go about doing it? Visualize gives us a couple ways to do that. So we'll take a look at that. Yeah, as far as which method might work the best for you. I'll say that I don't use the same method every time. So it just whatever scenario you're in, one method versus another might make the most sense. So hopefully we can clarify that a little bit and see so you know both options that you have available to you and what's going to work best for you in a certain situation, because that will always save you time. Lastly, I have just kind of a few things that I use on a regular basis, some shortcuts and little things that I use that I recommend people know when you're getting into Visualize. Some of them are specific to animation, but some of them are just in general tools that Visualize has that are good to know when you're working with animations to make that process a little bit smoother. And like I said, hopefully we'll have some time for some questions as well. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as we go too, if there are any questions. All right, so as far as background information, obviously we're getting into, we're going from a static image into an animation. So I guess ground level, what that is, what that means is normally when you're rendering things in SOLIDWORKS Visualize, you'd be setting things up. You have a camera angle that's in a particular direction. You're looking at the product and you're setting it up like you would be taking a photograph, right? Visualize is just like a virtual photo studio, basically, is what we have or what we're working with. So you would be setting your product in the way that you would set up your regular photo shoot. Maybe you put it on a table, or maybe you put it in an environment where it would normally naturally be. And then you're picking up your camera and you're choosing what lens you're going to put on. You're choosing what what focal distance you're going to be using, where your camera's physically going to go, and then where all your lighting is going to go, and all that kind of stuff, right? But the end result of all of that work is you hit render, and then you get a static image, right? So a single picture is your end result. So something like what's in the corner, you've just got one static shot. That's what most of the time you're working on in Visualize. The cool thing with Visualize is it has the capability, of course, to go beyond that with animations. This comes in the packages of Visualize Professional. It has the ability to do animations, as well as Visualize Connected. I have Visualize Connected that I'll be using today, but very similar to Visualize Professional in terms of functionality. Actually, everything that we'll look at today will be the same across those two. The nice thing with that is all of those techniques and things that you've learned to build up those images, those still all apply for moving your way into animation. So all of the work all of the things that you've learned and figured out how to do in Visualize, all of that stuff carries right over into animations. So you can just kind of like take that next step into making something that's even more engaging than just a single image. And of course, there are certain reasons why you might have for making an animation. Maybe it's going on your website, or maybe it's just for a video, for a presentation, whatever it is. We were talking earlier, Matthew, about setting up an animation or something for a presentation you're doing. It's just so much more engaging than just having even just a still image, which is that itself is much more engaging than just a screenshot or something like that, right? So all of those techniques, those basic photorealistic rendering techniques that you have learned, will apply. However, that being said, you'd probably want to know something about those on your way into animation. Certainly, you could learn those in the process of getting into animation as well. But I would recommend probably learning those on static images, just to try to like isolate things as you're going along that process. We won't talk about these too much in this presentation, simply because we don't have time. If you do have questions on just general setup stuff, by the time we get to the end and we have some extra time, we can jump back to these, no problem. But I figured these were kind of out of the scope of moving into animation. So I'm going to say that those types of things, setting up your appearances, creating appearances and adjusting appearances, environment selection and setup, and camera setup and things like that, would be things that you would probably want to have a decent grasp on. Wouldn't need to have them mastered, but have some idea how they work before you move into animation, because we'll be tuning and tweaking all of those settings in a sort of a time-based system. So having that groundwork is good. The next thing that you would want to know then is what a keyframe is. And this is actually a stumbling block for a lot of people just coming into animation. I find with Visualize, chances are a lot of times people coming into animating in Visualize is their first experience or first exposure to animation. So knowing how that process works is really important. So just sort of on a ground level of what animation is, so we've got basically two items that we'll have to work with. So when we get in the software, there's a whole section of the UI that's sort of stretched out. And that whole section that's stretched out along the bottom is called the timeline. And that's the way that you store all of the information that you'll be using to sequence whatever it is that you're trying to do. On a more generic level, on the left-hand side of the timeline, you'll see the items that you're trying to make changes to. Now, this is different from one type of animation software to the next. So if you've used some other animation, like 2D animation in After Effects, or maybe SOLIDWORKS Composer or SOLIDWORKS itself, the items that you're actually selecting here in this left-hand section will change. So every software has a different way of organizing things to try to make sense of it for you. So when we're animating in Visualize, again, we'll get to this, but you can either do some animation in SolidWorks and bring that in, or you can animate natively in Visualize. So either way, once you get to Visualize, the left-hand side will be the tracks of things that you're storing. So the way that Visualize handles this is these items off to the left-hand side will be all of the things that you're making changes to. All right, so it will sort of filter that out to only the things that are important to the animation that you're trying to create, okay? And the way that we store all of that information is with a keyframe. So along the top of any animation software, you'll see those little tick marks for the timeline. This is either in seconds or in frames most of the time. And we'll explain that differentiation in a moment. But either way, this is a time-based system across the top. All right, so what we need to do is store information and tell the animation software when something needs to happen. The way that we do that is with a keyframe. So when we put down a keyframe, it will look something like this, right? We have some kind of marker in the timeline that says this bit of information is stored at this point in time. And then from there, we can move it out to some other point in time and say, now store it here with some difference, right? So as soon as we make a change, we can store that at a different point in time. And then what the software does in any animation software is it will take this piece of information, whatever that piece of information is that we've stored, and it will transition it to whatever change we made at this point in time in between those two pieces. So the basis of animation is really simple. A lot of people will get tripped up in practice, kind of trying to get ahead of themselves or make it more complicated than it even needs to be. But animation in any sense is really just sort of a rinse and repeat kind of process. So all you need to do is start off at the point in time that you want something to change, right? And mark that start position. From there, you just need to figure out where you want the action to end and then mark that position there. So if you can think of it in that sense and just keep doing that over and over and over again, there really isn't a way that you can screw things up in terms of getting things all twisted. A lot of times people will just go in and start trying to add keyframes here, there, and everywhere. But if you take a somewhat methodical approach just before and after and just keep doing that over and over and over again, you'll always end up with what you're looking for. You may need to go back and say, okay, as I play this back, I want to change the timing of this a little bit and adjust your keys a little bit. But if you think of that rinse and repeat process, that will lead you to success every time. Right? That's the core of the process. Okay, so those little guys there are the keyframes, and then you'll see some activity in between as far as something's happening from here to here. Okay, the other thing that I want to mention here, because we're actually rendering this, is a set of expectations. So one of the things that you would want to know coming into rendering animations is this is going to take more time than it is to render a still image. So the way that an animation works, and I just mentioned in the timeline that the timeline can either be in frames or it can be in seconds, those two are tied together. So when we're playing back a video, so say we render something out, the final result, when we're playing back that video is being played back at a certain frame rate. So it's a number of frames per second. So what that means is that whatever created that video had to create a certain number of frames per second, blends all of those together, and then our eyes process it as a video, right, as continuous motion. Normally, if you're playing something back, some standard video, it would be in 30 frames per second, 24 to 30 frames per second is what standard videos would be. Why we care about that is because when we're making these, when we're doing the heavy lifting of creating them, those still frames, each one of those still frames we need to produce, right? So when you're watching a Disney movie and it's 2 hours long, you think about all the frames that would need to fit in there, as 30 of those per second need to fit in there. That's a lot of processing, and it is a lot of processing no matter which way you go about it. So what I usually do is up front, I try to find a still image of approximately what it is I'm going to be animating, and just render that one image and see about how long it's going to take. And then I just multiply that out to get some sense of what my rendering time is going to look like. Now, of course, rendering time is totally dependent on what your scene looks like, the complexity, how much light you have available, and obviously heavily dependent on the graphics, capabilities of your computer. So your CPU speed potentially, and your GPU or your graphics card. So that actual time will vary quite a bit. But get a sense with one frame to see about how long that's going to be, and then you can pretty quickly figure out how long it's going to take you to render that video. So if you're going to need 30 frames per second, take that one, however long it took to render that one frame, multiply that out by 30, and then however long you need your animation to be will give you a rough estimate of about how long that's going to take to render. So it's always good to plan ahead with these. Visualize is very quick in that it can take advantage of the CPU, can take advantage of the GPU, or it can take advantage of both. So you have a lot of speed there, but you also have a lot of things that you're going to need to compute. So thinking about that ahead could help you out, because you may want to plan a block of time where you don't need your machine. You can just let it process away. Make sense? Now, what I mentioned Disney, what full-scale operations do is they have full like render farms where they've just got computer after computer after computer after computer, and they send this out, right? They send their data out, farm it out to individual computers that will do the computing, send it all back and compile it. Otherwise, as I mentioned, that 2-hour-long movie that you're watching would never get produced. Somewhere along the way, I found this little image that said that the little sound that they set for finished rendering, they set to animal sounds. So their whole render farm would just kind of like make actual farm noises as they were going along. I have no idea if this is true, but I thought it was funny. I might do that on my computer one of these days, just set it to a pig sound or something when my rendering is done, just to make myself laugh. So again, of course, we don't have rendering farms. Generally, most of us don't have rendering farms at our disposal. I have a couple of machines sometimes that I bounce back and forth with, but we don't have rooms full of computers. So there's a couple things that I wanted to mention that you can do to try to help yourself in this scenario where obviously everyone has some, your machine can only do what it can do. So in order to optimize that, or to try to make things quicker or be able to get more done, there are 3 things that I take a look at before I send this out, just to try to make these projects doable. The first one is to reduce the resolution. You would be surprised how far you can go with this. I think, I have a tendency to try to make everything as high a quality as humanly possible, right? Crank it up to 4K and just let it go. That might not be required. And I find that with animations, a lot of the time, you can actually detune the quality more than you would think you would, and you don't really notice. Your eye is more drawn to the actual motion of what's going on, that you don't actually notice the quality as much as it would if it were just one single frame that your eye is just sort of poring over, right? So you have a little bit more freedom in detuning the quality a little bit, which will in turn speed things up for you. So resolution is one of the things that I look at first. Resolution is just the size of the actual image. So the more pixels the computer needs to process, the longer it's going to take. So if you can reduce some of those, that helps quite significantly. So when you're exporting things, when you're setting your export settings on your way out, the resolution is definitely something that I would look at. In this case, maybe set it to 720, might even be enough for what you're going to do. If this is a video that's going to be dropped into a website or into PowerPoint or something like that, it might only be shown, at that size anyway. So any rendering that you're doing over the resolution you need, or it's just going to be wasting time. All right, so having that sense going in is good. If you can set your resolution to something that makes the most sense, that will help you. The other thing that I look at is the number of passes. Now, again, these are things that I kind of listed up front, so hopefully I'm not confusing anybody here that isn't too familiar with static images. All of this stuff applies there as well. The number of passes is the number of times that the machine is going over those sections. So Visualize uses a ray tracing type solution, where it's basically just tracing rays of light around your scene, seeing where they bounce and where they land. Essentially, the more times it does that, the more accurate results you're going to get. The closer the light simulation is going to be to what it thinks reality would be, and the better image you're going to get. Now, we're always kind of playing with these settings to try to get to do the least amount of passes and get the best result as possible. But where you're going to see the difference on these is the noise that shows up. So the more passes you will run, the less noisy the image is going to look, typically in your shadowy areas. All right, so you can turn this back quite a bit. And in fact, some of the videos that I've done in the past, I've actually just run using fast mode, which at the time was 100 passes by default, and you probably wouldn't really notice the difference. In fact, I have one in this presentation that we can look at later. So I would say you can get away with a lesser number here than you might think as well, for the same reasons as I listed above, right? The motion of the activity, whatever it is you're animating, is going to be very engaging. So if there's a little bit of noise in the shadow where it contacts the ground, it's going to be way less noticeable than it would be on a beauty image that you would be creating for, you know, the front screen of a website or a pamphlet or something like that. So you've got a little bit of flexibility there. The last thing that I'll note is Visualize has a built-in denoiser, an AI denoiser, which is great for still images, and you can certainly use it when you're producing animations as well. But I will issue a warning here that if you're using the denoiser is non-temporal, so it's not time-based. So that means that as it's rendering, the denoiser is looking at just the image that it's rendering at the current time. So it's rendering one frame, it denoises that. Then it moves on to the next frame, it will render that and denoise that. Then it moves on and so forth. So there's no link from one frame to the next. So the denoising might not be exactly the same from one frame to the next. Obviously things are moving, right? So the denoising that it's doing, it might not be identical. So that can lead to a little bit of flickering. That being said, if this is the only way that you're able to get a good looking result, it's usually not noticeable to most people. So I would say denoising is a possibility. It just may not get you as high of a quality as trying to up these other two settings. It is there and available. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So again, a little bit of groundwork. Hopefully we can pick up the pace a little bit. But again, if you have questions with just basic setup stuff, we may have time at the end that we can hit that. So the next logical step is, all right, so I know basically what an animation is, how it's supposed to sequence. How does that actually play out when we're using the software, right? So there's two options that we have available to us. And those two options are, as I mentioned earlier, we can import keyframes from SolidWorks, which is a really cool capability, or we can create them natively in Visualize. And we can take a look at an example of both of these. So if we're importing keys from SolidWorks, this typically gets used in a case where you've got an exploded view or something like that you've set up in SolidWorks, very easy to set up. You want to just take that information and sort of recycle that and use that maybe in a higher quality setting like you would in Visualize, render that out to make a more engaging product than just, you know, shaded view that comes straight out of SolidWorks. The other option that we have available to us is to just create the keyframes natively in Visualize. I tend to use this option more so than I do from SolidWorks. But to be totally honest with you, I don't really know why. I feel comfortable animating in Visualize. There's nothing wrong with either approach, I guess is what I'm saying here. So we can take a look at both options here. And in fact, I was going to go through the next section, but I think I'm just going to jump into the software so we can take a look at some things, take a break from PowerPoint here. But either method is totally acceptable. Let's start maybe with the import from SolidWorks. That probably makes the most sense. So let me open up SolidWorks here. Again, I mentioned earlier, but I'm not sure if it was while the recording was running. I am using the 3D Experience versions of our setup. So I have SolidWorks Connected and I have Visualize Connected on this machine. As far as what we're going to be doing, you wouldn't notice any differences with SolidWorks Connected, and the functionality that we'll be looking at in Connected Visualize will be identical to what you would see in Visualize Professional. All right, so again, the scenario here would likely be that you have your SolidWorks setup already done. A lot of times you're making exploded views for other purposes, right? Maybe you're making exploded views for your drawings or just for the model itself so you can visualize things. The great thing with these two tools being kind of hand in hand here is that we can transfer that data back and forth. I guess I should mention there is a point of difference here between Connected and regular desktop SolidWorks, and that desktop SolidWorks does have an add-in that you can actually push data to have it open visualize. I'm just going to save the animation into SolidWorks right now, and when it imports, we'll get that information. But there is a small difference in the way that you can. This method that we'll be looking at works in both. So the way that I typically take advantage of this is if I have an exploded view already created in SolidWorks, you can create keys from that, just like we were talking about earlier. You can create keys from that very quickly and easily. So you can see down here, I have taken my motion study and imported those keys. Now, if you're not familiar with that process, it's very simple. So let me just create a new motion study here so we can see how that works. If you have an exploded view already created, and I won't take the time to make one here, but if you have an exploded view here, this animation wizard will bring in all sorts of things, extract all sorts of information from things you have set up already in SolidWorks, and it will write keys for them. Again, huge benefit here is that we can take those keys and import them into Visualize downstream. So if we use this little animation wizard here, we can choose from some of the presets that are available to us from right within the wizard. So you can see that there's a rotate option, there's an explode and collapse. I probably wouldn't bother using the rotate model and then importing those keys into Visualize. You certainly could, but we'll take a look at rotation right native in Visualize when we get there. But I would use one of these guys. If you have a mate controller, that's a great chance to take advantage of the mate controller setup and write those as keys that you can then bring in. The only thing you would want to watch out for is things that are in context, where SolidWorks is rebuilding parts as they go frame by frame. Visualize doesn't have any way to rebuild those, so you'd want to be careful of that. Anything else will come directly in. So for example, let's say we wanted to just make a collapse animation. So if I take my my collapse option, check that on, go to next, we can set how long we want this to be. I'll just leave it at the default of 10 seconds because it doesn't matter for what we're doing here, and hit finish. What you'll see is that it will take all of the information for that you've already created in the exploded view, and it will just set them down as keys. So as I scrub through this playhead, you'll see it's just automatically created an animation of what we would play back, right? This is the same thing that we would play back if you just animated your exploded view. All right, but it's actually stored information in here. Now, as soon as this study is saved into the SolidWorks model, we're ready to go. That's all we have to do. So the way that you would save that into the model itself is just check that little option there that says basically just store this with the SolidWorks model itself. And what that allows us to do is, with that baked in, it's already ready to import. We don't have to do anything else. When we bring this model into Visualize, that information is there and accessible. All right, so let's switch over here. I'll just start a new project, and we'll just bring that in from scratch, and you can see what happens here. See, I've got a little bit of lag on my screen, so I'll try to move a little slowly here. I have this saved right on the 3D Experience platform, so I'm just going to bring it in from there so I don't have to go browsing on my machine to find it. Helps if you spell it correctly. I lost my connection here. Okay, that's all right. I know where I saved it. I should mention, as I'm looking for this file here, that Visualize brings in all sorts of data. So one of the big benefits that I see of Visualize is that you can bring data from all over the place. Obviously, it's designed to work well with SolidWorks data. So I'm just bringing in the SolidWorks assembly right here, but you can also bring in data from all over the place. It takes in other types of CAD data as well as just regular graphics style data as well. And when you bring those in, you'll get, as soon as you hit import, you'll get the opportunity to choose what it is you want to do with that information once you get into Visualize, right? So this little box that pops up will let us tune what information we will then have access to. So this is an important pop-up, and a lot of times people will just sort of ignore the import settings and say, yeah, it's probably fine the way that it is. I would encourage you to take a moment and stop when this pops up. I do often do some fine tuning in here just to set myself up for what it is that I want to do when I get there. So an important option here at the top would be part grouping. So here you'll see that we have a few different options. This new option at the top is probably your way to go if you're using the 22 version. Otherwise, this would be called like automatic, the automatic mode. One of those two would probably be the best, and certainly if you're going to use these for animations, I would encourage that. Another one, for example, that you might often use would be like an appearance grouping, and what the difference there would be is instead of getting like a sort of typical tree in your components, it would start grouping things together by appearance. So one appearance, whatever is all of the same appearance, it would treat as one part. Now that's very helpful if you're just trying to make a whole bunch of different color variations of a product. Not so helpful if you're trying to move the individual components. So definitely an important thing to take a look at when you're importing, especially for the purposes of animations. Make sure you're choosing one of the part grouping options that gives you access to the individual components. Okay. From there, we would want to check on, of course, appearances if you want to keep those. And then lastly, we would want to make sure that we have animations checked on. So if we want to bring in an animation, we would want to bring that animation in with that option checked on. If that's not on, no matter what we have saved into the file, it's not going to come through. Okay. Decals, lastly, would be the other thing that you would turn on if you have decals. I don't think there are any decals in this one, so it probably doesn't matter. Lastly, these two in the middle is totally up to you as far as what you're going to want to do with the file. I have a tendency to leave these off because I do all of my camera work and scene setup right in Visualize. So I don't really need anything that that SolidWorks had at this point. I leave them off. That will be personal preference. Okay. Now, once we get into Visualize, shoot, I didn't have this file saved. Once we get into Visualize, what you would normally see, if I hadn't had this set up incorrectly, is these keyframes would already automatically be populated with the setup that we had, right, that explode animation that we already had set up. So with that method of baking it into the SolidWorks file, bringing that into Visualize, we don't have to do any setup at all in Visualize to get that animation set. The only thing we would want to do is then set our camera wherever we want our camera angle to be, and that's really it. We have all of the motion already of the individual components. Okay. Now, apparently, I didn't have that motion study saved into that file that I opened. Let me see. Let me see what I have here. Oh, here we go. Apparently I just can't type. Let me bring this one in because I know the one that I saved to the platform does have the motion study saved. Okay. All right, so same process. I'm just loading this SolidWorks assembly from the 3D Experience platform instead of my local drive. I'm going to use the same setup here. We'll say okay. Okay, so again, once you get a file that has the motion study saved, we're back to what I was describing, and now you can picture. If I look down here in my timeline, we see again what I was describing earlier. So we've got our time going across the top here. Default is set to time, but you can see you can actually switch one to the other time or frames. And then on the left-hand side, we have all of the items that are something is changing, right? Something is changing over some span of time for all of these items on the left-hand side. Now, again, this is nice because you may already be familiar with setting up our exploded views or things like that in SolidWorks, or maybe even you're familiar with animating in SolidWorks already. Any of that stuff that you already know how to do can come straight in, right? So you can bring that in and you've already got access to all of it in your rendering software. All you have to do is just set up the way that you want it to actually look in Visualize. Okay, you can see all that motion is already there. So that is definitely a very efficient way to get going with animations, especially if you have that background. Cool. One thing I didn't mention, actually, when I came into Visualize, my timeline wasn't visible, right? And it was just our normal Visualize interface. If you're working in the versions of Visualize that are capable of producing animations, again, being Visualize Connected or Visualize Professional, all you need to do to see your timeline is to use the T key on your keyboard, and that will bring your timeline up or show your timeline. Now, of course, you can also go into the view settings to turn that on. You can adjust your any of your interface settings through the view here, but the T key is a handy one to know, and I think I have it on my list later for things that are helpful to know. Because a lot of times, the timeline takes up a bit of real estate, right? You're down here, maybe adjusting keys, and you've got this shrunk down to a smaller size if you don't have things all, laid out on multiple monitors or something. Sometimes it is nice to just hide your timeline so you can get a better look at what's going on at any given point in time in the animation, and then just return to your timeline so you can continue doing your work. So T key, good one to know when you're setting up animations. Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward method of setting up your animation. Let's take a step back and let's look at this the other way. If we had nothing to go from, right? No SolidWorks file to go from that might have potential information that we can use. Let's just start from scratch and say, I want to do everything directly in Visualize. Well, that method is pretty easy as well. So let's close this out. And we'll take a look at, actually, you know what? Let me move back to that other one that I had open there, because we were talking about earlier, even just a presentation or something can really benefit from an animation. And that's sort of the case with this guy here. This example I made for one of the contests that we were running here just a while back. And the goal was to just kind of create a PowerPoint presentation, right? And I had this exploded view already done. And I didn't necessarily want the components to, do anything crazy, explode or collapse or anything like that. But I wanted to be able to have a visual up, in the mock sense that I was presenting something, have a visual up that would allow us to get a view of all of the components at once, that we could sort of, talk as a group to all of the components and be able to see everything. So the way that I chose to do that was to just create a simple rotate animation. Now, again, that's one of the recommendations that I'll make later as you're getting into this. Start with something simple, and a rotate animation is a great way to do this. I think I have this video clip later in the presentation, but we can create it here on the fly. So again, I have these components in here. You'll notice in my timeline, there's nothing. There's no keys. We don't have anything set up. We've got a blank timeline and everything sort of before us. All I have is the components already exploded to about where I want them to be. All right, so in order to create keys in Visualize, we can use a right click and create key. We can use the K key on the keyboard, which is another shortcut tip that I have listed down as a good one to know. Or we can use a shortcut that's built into the right-click menu as well. Now, in order to take advantage of this, we need to make sure that we're selecting the right thing. So I want to take this whole unit as all of the geometry, and I want to rotate that whole thing. So hopefully I'm not going too far into the weeds here. Hopefully you guys are somewhat familiar with Visualize, in that there is a set of selection filters across the top here that we can use in the graphics area to pick up exactly what we want to select from the graphics area. And just as a quick overview, in case you're not familiar, the yellow guy is that option will select the whole model from the top level. The next is also a geometry filter, but it will select the part itself, so further down the tree level. The purple one is the group selection. I'll explain this one a little bit more when we get to the next example. And the last one is the appearance filter, and that will allow you to select the information for the appearance that you've clicked on screen. Now, again, I want to take this geometry as a whole and just spin it. So for my selection filter in this case, I'm going to select model, and then I'm going to click on any piece of geometry on here. And you'll see that that does a couple things immediately. It picks up the whole model itself. So whatever it was that I imported at that point in time, picks up the whole thing, highlights all of it in yellow, indicating that I've selected this whole thing. So anything that is selected will be outlined in yellow. And it switched my palette over to the models tab. So it's saying, okay, this is the model that I have selected for you. Perfect. All right, so I want to take this whole thing and spin it around. So at this point, you would think, okay, I could maybe use the manipulation tools, set a key and then spin it and then set another key. Totally valid approach. However, Visualize includes something here that's even easier for us to use. It's one of my favorite things to show people who are getting into animation. I mentioned that right click has the ability to add in a keyframe. If you forget the K key shortcut, animation, add keyframe, right? And it tells us this is the K key. But you'll notice underneath that, we have this option for add rotation animation, which is extraordinarily helpful. So if we add a rotation animation, what this does is it drops a couple keys down for us, just at a given span of time, and it will rotate the model automatically for us. We don't have to do anything else. So what we want to do here is take a look at this and say, okay, start scrubbing through this. All right, it's created a rotation animation for us, but it's taking a guess at what axis it wants to rotate about, and it's gone for the axis that's sort of down the barrel. Actually looks pretty cool, but wasn't what I was going for. I wanted to spin on the vertical axis so that the parts are kind of coming out at us, so we can see all of the parts as they go around. The cool thing with this is it's very easy to fine tune. So all we have to do is double click on this anywhere in that region between those two keyframes, and you'll see that when we double click, it brings up some more information for us. Let me expand this up so you guys can get a better look at this. Hopefully you can see that down there. Right, so once we double click, this brings up some properties for us. Now we can do this across the board with animation and Visualize. But once we have our piece selected, you'll notice that this rotation animation has now a drop down that we can use to switch the axis that it's rotating on. We can pick a different axis and it will still keep that rotation animation. So this is a very quick way to get a lot of motion without really any effort at all. Select whatever it is you want to have move, right click, add a rotation animation, and just choose if it doesn't happen to pick the right axis, choose what axis you want to rotate it on. Now you'll also notice down here you have the ability to change the total rotation. So if you wanted to rotate 3 times instead of once, you can do that right within here, and it will all be baked into a couple sets of keys that are very easy to manage. So if you've seen this example somewhere along the way with this just kind of spinning around, right, I just set that with 2 clicks, rendered it out, put it in my PowerPoint presentation, set it on loop, and now that's spinning around in sort of a photorealistic kind of way. And I did almost no work to create it, but it's a much more engaging way to look at it and have a conversation about the design. All right, now if you take this maybe up a notch back to the first example that I was going for. I will explain how this kind of works in combination. So across the top, we had multiple selection filters, right? And I would recommend that you get comfortable with the layout of what you have in your models tree. That will help you out a lot when you're setting up animations if you're going to do them natively in Visualize. Because you'll see that in this case, I have just a couple things rotating here. I have the blades rotating. These are helpful to be able to select in groups or to create groups if you want multiple things moving together. So for example, these little tip decals are actually pieces of the model. They're actually little, bits of geometry in there. I created those as a group so they all move together. And that really helps things out when you're going to create these animations because everything is stuck together as one lump that you want to move together. So you'll see that in your model tree here, we have the root. You'll always see that root group. And then from within there, you'll have groups that contain the actual geometry itself. All of this is flexible. That whole tree is flexible. So you can combine things together that you might want to move in groups. And I would recommend that you take advantage of that when you're setting up animations. So for example, let's take a step back here. Let's just delete out what I've got. And let's say, for example, that we want to maybe move all of these blades as one. That might make sense to make these as a group. So if I select these as the groups that they already are, because I have a couple components grouped there with them, and use something like our edit tools to modify our tree, we can make our lives a lot easier when we're setting up our keyframes. So let's say we move to a new group, and we'll find these guys in the tree. So our blades are now set into a group. I'm actually going to regroup these guys. So now we have a group of all of the blades. And then we have groups of those individual components that are the individual blades that I want to move together. These types of little things will make a big difference in the way that you're setting these things up. Because from here, I can set up rotation animations on these little pieces like I had, right? So we can go to animation, add rotation, add rotation on each one of those blades. And if we look at this, our blades should now all be spinning. Yep. But let's say we wanted all of those to come off together and like an explode, which I'll show you an example of later. I now have a group of all of the blades as well, right? So if I right click and animation, add a keyframe, or select it and hit the K key on my keyboard, that adds a keyframe for the whole group of components that I can now do something else with, right? I can move these up or something. Now that motion is combined because I'm taking all of the whole group of components and I'm moving them up. At the same time, I've got a set of keys that are making them rotate. Okay, so that rinse and repeat action that I talked about early in the presentation is really that process, right? You see me moving my playhead back and forth, right? Wherever that playhead is, that's where we're storing information, and you see those keys being created at that point in time. These are all movable after the fact. So if you don't like where you created these keys, you can simply drag and drop these, and that will affect the timing of what happens. So if you want them to start spinning for a little bit, right, and then start lifting off, stop lifting off and continue spinning, right, all of these keyframes are adjustable. Again, if you wanted these to spin, say, more than they're doing one rotation, double click on those and you can edit any of those rotation animations, right? We can maybe add a 0 to this. Something like that. Have these spin even faster. 0. Okay. Now we should see these spin even quicker. There they go. Now at this point, once I get whatever motion it is that I'm trying to go after, it's really just a matter of what your camera is doing, adding a little bit of life maybe with your camera. So the camera is just an object that can be animated in the same sense that anything else in the scene can be animated. So if we move back to our camera tab here, I have a camera. If you saw my live stream for Visualize a couple of weeks ago maybe, you may have picked up on this tip that I have a tendency to lock my cameras. Once I get a camera angle that I like, I lock it. Definitely recommend that as an option. So I do a free camera and then I lock my other camera. I do this as well with animations, but obviously the camera needs to move with an animation, right? So you're gonna have to be changing things in there. You can't have it locked. So what I usually do is I take my locked camera and I leave it alone so I can always come back to it. So I'll just take this camera and then I'll just Control D or right click and duplicate and make a separate one that I can come back to and make my changes for the animation. So I'll unlock my duplicate and mark that for animation or however you want to do that. Oops, I unlocked the wrong one, but either one is fine. All right, so then you've got one that's sort of your backup camera that is saved exactly the way that you had everything set up. And then you have one that's totally flexible. All right, so again, cameras work just like any other object that's in there. You can use the K key on the keyboard. Make sure you've got the right one selected. I had the wrong one selected. Select the one that you want to create a camera key for and hit K, or you can right click and set a key. Now I accidentally set a key. You can always delete those animations. So anything on this left-hand side, you can click on that, hit delete if you have made a mistake. Now I know that this is maybe the ending frame, right? That shot that I have set up is more what I want, where I want the camera to land. And I have my playhead at the beginning of the animation when I saved that key. So rather than fiddle with this and try to delete it and move back, all I need to do is just move this key back down to where I want this to land. And then I can move my camera to the orientation that I want to see it in at the beginning of the animation. So from here, it's as simple as just moving your camera around like you normally would in Visualize. So we can start rotating and moving the camera around. A little tip here that I think I have later in my notes, and I guess we're already close on time, so I'll hurry this up here. But a little tip that's helpful to know when you're setting up animations is resetting the point of the camera, or the focus point of the camera. The shortcut for that is Alt, Shift, and right click. So I've clicked on my quadcopter there, and you can see now the camera is centering on that object. That helps a lot when you're trying to get a specific camera angle, especially if you're orbiting around something like this, to get that camera angle in the right spot and get the motion consistent. Very helpful to have your camera focused on the piece that you want. Okay, now you'll see that as soon as I make a move, my key is being created for me. If you're wondering why that happened, that's because I have my auto keys turned on. You can turn on or off auto keys. We won't get too far into the weeds there, but that's why these keyframes are being created for me automatically as soon as I move something. And here we now have sort of a finished idea where the camera sort of rotates around. And then once you're happy with that, you can switch into your whatever you're doing for your rendering setup. And you'll see this will move a little bit slower as it's rendering, but you've now got all of that information ready to be rendered out and baked into an animation. Okay, I see some activity in the chat. Matthew says, great tip about denoising animations. Cool, awesome. All right, so I'm already been yapping for a while, so let me pop back to my presentation here. If you do have any questions at this point, you can go ahead and ask them. I'll leave this slide up You can put them in the chat, or if you're able to unmute, you can go ahead. And just a couple of things that I had here, and I think I mentioned several of them as we were going through, but good shortcuts to know. T turns on your timeline on or off. K key is good for creating those keyframes. Alt Shift right click, it's a good one for relocating the center of your camera. That's a good one. Easing defaults I didn't mention, but you saw it in action. So the easing is by default set to smooth. That is something that I just recommend checking. So just go into your tools options and just see that it's set to smooth. You probably do want it set to smooth for almost everything because that's the most natural look. I'll say it gives a little bit of that easing. Tools options, user interface. And this section here, timeline options. This should be set to smooth by default, and it's worth checking just to make sure that it is, because that will give you the most natural feeling animations for most things. You'll notice that you can make changes to that. So if you have those keys selected, see that there is tension and motion easing and things that you can make changes to independently. I would recommend setting your default, or making sure your defaults are set to smooth, which and they should be by default. All right, start simple. That's a good thing. I have just three ways that you can start simple that I usually recommend. Just do camera motions. You would be surprised with what you can come up with by just moving the camera, moving nothing else, just tracking your camera around in your scene to create animation. Simple rotate we talked about, or animated decals is not come across because looks like I've got a little bit of delay, but this was an example of an animation that I did, again using that method. This is up on YouTube if it's skipping around, but nothing more than just moving the camera around. No components move, nothing. It's just the camera sliding around, racking focus, playing with different settings on the camera, but relatively engaging while not a whole lot of complexity, right? Same with that guy that we talked about earlier. Again, this is a nice visual that you can just talk to. You can see all of the components. This is a lot more engaging than one camera angle that inevitably somebody ends up saying, oh, what's behind this or what's behind that. If something is just moving, you can always, point out, this is the part that I'm talking about right here. Oh yeah, of course.
And the use of color.
Thanks.
Use of color, being able to point to things and say the blue part, the red part. Yep. People know right away what that is.
Absolutely.
How many times have we all looked at screenshots of gray blobs? It's this gray blob. Well, which, right?
Yeah, the third one back from the left.
Exactly. Don't count blobs.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. It just helps so much.
Yeah.
It really does.
One beyond just posting up on the PowerPoint like a 2D drawing, like the conversation you can have around this design, way easier to engage people. Another thing I could offer from industry too, the job I had before here was a marine equipment designer. My team did everything above deck on the ship, but I still worked with the naval architect to get the 2D drawings of the hull to model and render together, which told a better story even internally of what it is that we're doing. If you're on a team that's doing one piece of a project, see if you can get the other structure, even though it's not fleshed out internally, just to tell a better story of what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. And that kind of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, and that you can pull in all sorts of data. So you can, that drone example that I have in the corner, right? This, I got a rock from a turbo squid, I think I got for $6 or something US, not much, and, modeled a couple other pieces for some context, but you can get stuff from everywhere, right? If somebody else in your company has something, you can pull it in. If you can find it somewhere for free or for purchase, you can pull it in and you can tell that story so much more effectively if you've got the environment that the thing is in. I totally agree.
That's very cool.
This animation that's up was just a point that I wanted to mention. A lot of people don't know that you can use decals that are just video files. You're not stuck to just regular images for decals. This is not a spectacular rendering by any means, but I just threw a video in on the screen and suddenly it's way more engaging, right? You know, if this was just sitting on its own, it's like, yeah, cool, that's cool. But seeing it, you know, in use for something is way more engaging.
For anyone out there that's looking for work, can you imagine showing this video clip in an interview of the impact this would make of a prototype that you've done?
Mm-hmm.
All sorts of ways you can leverage this.
Yeah, exactly right. And again, the cool thing is this is minutes of setup. I mean, it's literally just the camera moving. The object is just sitting there. I dragged in a video file and I just slowly moved the camera and let it render. It's not any kind of complex setup.
Well, Jesse, this is all available through the SOLIDWORKS for Makers offer, correct?
Yeah. So I was using Visualize Connected. So yeah, Visualize Connected has the lion's share of stuff that's available in Professional, which is absolutely awesome. I think that's so cool that they built all that stuff in. So Connected, yeah, I mean, I'm using Connected right now. So if you've got a seat of Visualize Connected, then you can do anything we're talking about.
I'll drop that in the chat as well. If there's any SOLIDWORKS champions like Mohammed in the group, we also get the Makers offer for free. So the same thing you're seeing Jesse doing, we get that for free. If you have questions on how to get there and how to use it, let me know. I'm going to drop that in the chat too. Lots of ways to access these tools.
Yeah, it's really cool. Yesterday I saw mine.
Yeah, this was, again, I'm not sure how well this is coming through, but I'll drop the volume on this, but just some examples similar to what we were setting up, right? Nothing crazy about these. This shot is a little more complex, but again, you watch me set up basically exactly what this is, right? Just a little slowed down, but that's it. Annotations I added in post, but everything else is right out of Visualize.
That's really cool.
And product sitting there with the light moving. Very simple setups.
I think that might be my favorite one.
Yeah. Doesn't take much with an animation to make something really come to life. A lot of fun. This particular project, I wanted to see if I could make something usable with as minimal effort as humanly possible. So that thing that I was just playing was that project. And so what I tried to do is just take like 10-15 minutes at the end of the day, set up an animation and just let it render. You know, I just, when I go to eat dinner or whatever, just let it render while my computer is going. And then when I come back in the morning, it's got something. If I like the clip, awesome, you know, made the cut. If I didn't like it, who cares? I didn't waste any time on it, you know. I set up another one the next night. So I just tried to do that and just see if I could come up with something that I could use for something without, you know, with essentially no effort. It was my goal. And I think it succeeded. It came out with, you know, obviously it was for no purpose. It was just an exercise for me, but I certainly came up with something usable and really didn't have much into it. So that was a cool sort of proof for myself.
One of the tips I learned from industry with Visualize, the process of rendering is very resource heavy, potentially. If you're using a laptop, making sure it's plugged in. If you're using a desktop, making sure you have a battery backup, ideally, in case you lose power, you don't lose a huge render.
And making sure it's plugged in. That does help.
And plugged in, right? Yeah, all these little things on the back end, making sure your computer is operating well. Go ahead.
That is a good point, actually, if I could jump off of that.
Yeah.
A lot of times what I do with, well, all the time, what I do when I'm rendering animations, I never actually make the final MP4. I always just render the frames themselves, which is a real benefit if you do lose power or something like that, or if you get partway through the animation, you realize, oh shoot, I messed up something in the middle of the animation. You can just stop it and then just re-render that span of frames and compile it again later, right? There's free ways you can compile, but if you have any video editing software, you can compile them all back into a video after the fact. But that is a little pro tip. I almost never render straight to video. just in case something happens or I want to change something in the middle. I always just render straight to frames and then put it together as a video later.
Cool.
Yep, I
That's
do that.
one of my favorite parts about the SOLIDWORKS community. I've been using this stuff for 10 years and I still learn something new every time people get together.
Absolutely.
Yep. Every day you're gonna find like something new and interesting. I started learning Visualize since 2020, maybe. Yeah. I watched your video, your previous video, and you made for like with cat dimension, and start with that.
Yep.
Let me show like I got some stuff that I learned from it. Doing like a simple. Let's go.
Very cool. Yeah, I have quite a few videos from my previous life at CAD Dimensions, as you mentioned. I have quite a few Visualize videos up there. So if you browse around on their channel, I'm sure they're still there. This was, part of one of them, as you mentioned.
Yeah. I did that. The simple stuff.
Cool.
Yeah, using Visualize. Really start learning stuff. And also this animation about like heater.
Cool.
Yeah, I get behind that,
I love that. I love that idea of the
very creative
coming out of the drawing. It always looks so cool.
Yeah.
Mohammed, can you post that in the Champions community?
Okay, sure.
This one, that is really cool, man.
Very cool.
Yeah. From like I get the idea behind that. I want to show my engineering background through drawing, and after that to convert that to make something like cosmetics, more cosmetics, in order to the customer understand the concept of the shape itself.
Yep. Very cool.
Great. Well, I got to run to another meeting, but thanks, Jesse, for presenting all this. Gonna get a +1 in the chat for Jesse. Show him some love.
Nice.
Yeah.
Mohammed, hope to see you again soon, man. Thanks for opening it up to all of us here at SOLIDWORKS.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for.
Catch you guys later.
Yeah.
Take it easy. Very cool. Does anybody have? I didn't pop back to the actual chat. Does anybody have any other questions? I still got a few minutes. If you do, hopefully I didn't go too fast. I know that was kind of flying overview, but there's a lot of information potentially in there that you need. Hopefully that at least give you some groundwork of where you might be going or where you should be looking.
Yeah, you give a little bit more information about animation, more tips about that. I'm excited, to show you what's next level that I got through this meeting. Always interested in like something new, and through this platform, it's easy way in order to get more information for a professional like you. I watch you since I start learning SOLIDWORKS. You and Mike Sandy and Christopher Mott. You are in my favorite list, so I try every day in order to.
Very cool, man. Well, like I said earlier, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed. And if you guys make any animations, as Matthew said, post them up. Tag me on LinkedIn or whatever. If you make an animation, love to see it.
Yeah, cool. So, okay.
All right.
Looks
like we're good.